Welcome back. We are starting Numbers chapter 32, and I have said on numerous occasions that uh, I need a better way to start these, but then I'm like, no, I don't, because I listen to podcasts a lot, and if there's a long intro, I skip past it anyway. So don't skip past this. It's very important stuff. Not really, it's not, but if this is your first video, I would suggest you go back to the beginning because that will lay a lot of the groundwork for what we're about to see. We've been building up to for about 40 years. So in some cases, hundreds of years, but specifically this event. So we're in Numbers chapter 32. There's a couple of things that actually the New Living Translation gets better than the complete Jewish Bible. So we're going to read from the New Living Translation, and I'll point that out when we get there. The tribes of Reuben and Gad owned vast numbers of livestock. So when they saw that the lands of Jazer and Gilead were ideally suited for their flocks and herds, they came to Moses, Eleazar the priest, and the other leaders of the community. They said, "Notice the towns of Ataroth, Dabon, Jazer, Nimrah, Heshbon, Eliel, Sibmah, Nebo, and Beon. The Lord has conquered this whole area for the community of Israel, and it is ideally suited for all our livestock. If we have found favor with you, please let us have this land as our property instead of giving us land across the Jordan River. Do you intend to stay here while your brothers go across and do all the fighting?" Moses asked the men of Gad and Reuben, "Why do you want to discourage the rest of the people of Israel from going across the land to the land the Lord has given them? Your ancestors did the same thing when I sent them from Kadesh Barnea to explore the land. After they went up to the valley of Eshcol and explored the land, they discouraged the people of Israel from entering the land the Lord was giving them. Then the Lord was very angry with them, and he vowed, 'Of all those I rescued from Egypt, no one who is 20 years old or older will ever see the land I swore to give to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, for they have not obeyed me wholeheartedly. The only exceptions are Caleb, son of Jephunneh, and the Kizite, and Joshua, son of Nun, for they have wholeheartedly followed the Lord.' The Lord was angry with Israel and made them wander in the wilderness for 40 years until the entire generation that sinned in the Lord's sight had died." So if you're wondering, is this really important? Yes, because the last time this happened, God started this 38-year adventure out in the wilderness and took away the opportunity to go directly into the promised land. So they gave up the opportunity of a lifetime, of a generation, of a people out of fear and lack of obedience. So what Moses sees is someone trying to do the same thing again. So we'll pick back up in verse 14. It says, "But here you are, a brood of sinners doing exactly the same thing. You are making the Lord even angrier with Israel. If you turn away from him like this and he abandons them again in the wilderness, you will be responsible for destroying this entire nation." So you kind of see where Moses is coming from, because he remembers when this happened last time, 38 years ago, and he didn't want to go back and everybody die again. Uh, and so this is the verse that really matters. And it says, "But they approached Moses and said," and this is where the word approached in Hebrew really means to beseech, to ask for. So seeing their attitude at this point is important, because what we're about to see is them figuring some things out too. But they're still negotiating. But they approached Moses and said, "We simply want to build pens for our livestock and fortified towns for our wives and children. Then we will arm ourselves and lead our fellow Israelites into battle until we have brought them safely to their land. Meanwhile, our families will stay in the fortified towns we build here, so they will be safe from any attacks by the local people. We will not return to our homes until all the people of Israel have received their portions of land. But we do not claim any of the land on the other side of the Jordan. We would rather live here on the east side and accept this as our grant of land." Then Moses said, "If you keep your word and arm yourselves for the Lord's battles, and if your troops cross the Jordan and keep fighting until the Lord has driven out his enemies, then you may return when the Lord has conquered the land. You will have fulfilled your duty to the Lord and to the rest of the people of Israel, and the land on the east side of the Jordan will be your property from the Lord. But if you fail to keep your word, then you have sinned against the Lord, and you may be that sin, and you may be sure that your sin will find you out. Go ahead and build towns for your families and pens for your flocks, but do everything you have promised." Then the men of Gad and Reuben replied, "We, your servants, will follow your instructions exactly. Our children, wives, flocks, and cattle will stay here in the towns of Gilead. But all who are able to bear arms will cross over to fight for the Lord, just as you have said." So Moses gave orders to Eleazar the priest, Joshua son of Nun, and the leaders of the clans of Israel. He said, "The men of Gad and Reuben who are armed for battle must cross the Jordan with you to fight for the Lord. If they do, give them the land of Gilead as their property when the land is conquered. But if they refuse to arm themselves and cross over with you, then they must accept land with the rest of you in the land of Canaan." The tribes of Gad and Reuben said again, "We are your servants, and we will do as the Lord has commanded. We will cross the Jordan into Canaan fully armed to fight for the Lord, but our property will be here on this side of the Jordan." So Moses assigned land to the tribes of Gad, Reuben, and half the tribe of Manasseh, son of Joseph. He gave them the territory of King Sihon of the Amorites and the land of King Og of Bashan, the whole land with its cities and surrounding lands. The descendants of Gad built the towns of Dibon, Ataroth, Aror, Athroth, Shapson, Hazer, Jogbehah, Beth Nimrah, and Beth Haran. Those were all fortified towns with pens for their flocks. The descendants of Reuben built the towns of Heshbon, Elihah, Kirithaim, Nebo, Baal Meon, and Sibnah. They changed the names of some of the towns they conquered and rebuilt. Then the descendants of Machir, the tribe of Manasseh, went to Gilead and conquered it, and they drove out the Amorites living there. So Moses gave Gilead to the Machirites, the descendants of Manasseh, and they settled there. The people of Jair, another clan of the tribe of Manasseh, captured many of the towns in Gilead and changed the name of that region to the towns of Jair. Meanwhile, a man named Nobah captured the town of Kenath and its surrounding villages, and he renamed that area Nobah after himself. I love that because not that that's the right thing to do, but he was like, "I want to name it after me. I conquered it. I'm going to name it after me." So the conquest of the promised land has begun, obviously. So Moses is a little frightened and angry because he thinks people are going to do what they did 38 years ago. You know, the leadership council and a lot of the people were like, "Oh, I don't think we should do this." And the consequences were pretty bad. A lot of them died. Well, all of them died except for a few, very few. And so Moses reminds everyone what happened at Kadesh and why it happened and not to repeat it. That's one of the reasons we should read scripture daily, because it's a reminder of what we did, what we shouldn't do, and why we shouldn't do it, and keep us seeing the good things that come out of God's word. It's a daily reminder. So in essence, Reuben and Gad would live outside the camp of Israel, technically, because that was outside the promised land. Gad had a little different destiny than Reuben. Jacob gave Gad the smallest of blessings. We learned that back in Genesis. And so Gad had a little different thing going on. His blessing was mainly about military force, that they would be militarily strong, and the fact that they would have to fight their enemies for pretty much ever. So in other words, Gad was going to be a tribe of warriors. They were constantly having to fight enemies that they would make, but in the end, they would generally win. They became really good at it. You know, sometimes a guy that gets beat up a lot becomes a really good fighter. So in the Lord's divine providence, though, they provided protection to protect the other tribal territories because they were so feared. They could protect that area while most of Israel went and conquered the promised land. So even though they weren't doing what God wanted them to do, he was still using their choices to further his will. And that's the beautiful thing about God. He can use anything. So like I said, the verse 16 is important because the Hebrew for came up or approached is, and I'm probably saying this wrong, but it's va yigashu, va yigashu, and it means to beseech someone. You know, they weren't demanding to stay. They wanted to explain their reasoning, and they wanted to ask. They were approaching Moses. So it puts a little different spin on it, but what Moses saw was God's going to be angry with what you're doing, when in fact God was using that as a staging area for the people to get into the promised land and leave a lot of the wives and children behind protected. So about half of the largest Israelite tribe, Manasseh, decided that they wanted to stay. So this would be traumatic, and it would have everlasting consequences, obviously. But you know, for a tribe to split meant that there were two clans that were fighting, or two leaders that wanted to be in charge, or two clans that wanted to be in charge. So that would cause a split, and then this will cause ripples through the day you're listening to this. Something's going on in the Middle East that's probably related in some way to these kind of decisions right here. And most importantly, what I would say this chapter is really about is follow God all the way, not most of the way, not enough of the way that it's comfortable, but all the way. Wherever he calls you, go there. Because any less, you're missing the land of milk and honey, his ultimate blessing. You're trading for something a little less, maybe a lot less. And that's why when we started Leviticus, I said it's like not ever seeing the blueprint for what was supposed to be there, but you might be happy with the house you have now. But imagine if you knew what the original conception was. God has way more for us. I can promise you that. But he also ultimately has a way for us to live abundantly. And the only way to do that is to follow him, is to love him and to follow him and to know him. And you can't love him if you don't know him. You learn how to know who God is in the Old Testament, in the Torah. And you just finished Numbers chapter 32. So you're almost there. God bless. Share this with a friend or an enemy. It really doesn't matter. Love God, love people, and change the world.